The number one thing that everyone here in Israel is focused on are getting these captives out of Hamas captivity. Just last night, while he was boarding a plane to the Super Bowl, Trump made comments saying that the time is going to run out. These hostages need to come out. They look like Holocaust survivors. He was also comparing it to that point. I think right now in the short term, they're trying to find a solution to get these hostages out while also planning the future, of course. But I think there is an immediate pressure as we're seeing these horrific conditions of these hostages.
Eli Sharabi was finally released by Hamas at the weekend. His first public comments were about how much he wanted to see his British wife and daughters. What he didn't know was that they were all murdered by Hamas during the October the 7th attacks. In the end, the Israeli authorities had to tell him what had happened. We wonder what the impact of the latest hostage releases has had on the situation in Israel. So let's talk to Shosh Bedrosian, who's a reporter in Tel Aviv. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. What has the reaction been to this last release of hostages in terms of the mood, I suppose, about the ceasefire, about the way the future of the conflict might head?
Yeah, so this hostage release was absolutely a turning point. I don't think just for Israel, I think for the whole world, right? Because we saw 3 male hostages released from Hamas captivity in the worst conditions yet. Doctors from these hospitals where they're receiving treatment said they are experiencing the aftermaths of severe infection, malnutrition, severe psychological, mental, physical abuse. These men were held in the depths of the worst conditions, said to be in Gaza. When they left captivity and you saw them having to be forced to participate in this Hamas ceremony over the weekends when they were released, you saw visibly these men looking beyond thin compared to what they went going in. You mentioned Eli Sharabi. There's an image of him that you can see from before to now. It's scary to see. A lot of people here in Israel, around the world, are comparing their appearances to Holocaust survivors who were liberated from concentration camps in Europe. This topic touches really the soul of the Jewish people because of the experience with the Holocaust. Remember, there's a generation here in Israel that are survivors of the Holocaust. Their families went through this. A lot of them were child survivors, knowing the stories of their parents, their grandparents, seeing the conditions of their families in these camps. To see these men walk out of Gaza after 491 days, reflecting the same images that they saw after surviving these horrific atrocities in the 40s, speaks to this nation, speaks to this country and the Jewish people. They feel as if they are experiencing the same thing all over again, and the world is staying silent. It's important to say and show the realities of the situation. Eli Sharabi realized when he came out of captivity, he learned his entire family was slaughtered in their safe room on October 7th, right after he was taken captive. His brother Yossi was also taken captive with him. He was killed in Hamas captivity. Also, he was held with Or Levi, who was released the same time as him, who also looks like a skeleton of himself from before. He returned home and realized that his wife, Einav, was murdered that day inside of a mamad, a bomb shelter, after they fled the Nova Music Festival. He returned home to find out this news, but finally reunite with his 3-year-old son, Almog. When these hostages come out, we're able to learn a lot more information about the other hostages that are still in captivity. I want to tell you about Alon Ohel. He is 22 years old. He was taken from the Nova Music Festival, but Eli Sharabi and Or Levi were held with him in the tunnels there. Today marks his 24th birthday, and his parents, for the very first time, were able to get a sign of life from him through these 2 men that were released. The 2 men were able to tell his family that Alon has an eye injury. He can only see shadows in his wounded eye. He is shackled inside of tunnels, receives less than 1 pita a day to eat. Of course, the conditions of these men that are still in Hamas captivity is creating a dire point for these families here, especially as negotiators are working for phase 2 of this deal.
And Netanyahu is talking about what the future might look like, probably following Trump's lead here. He's now said overnight that Saudi Arabia could be a place for Palestinians to live. The Saudis have said no immediately, but it's this problem that's going to be a very difficult one for people to reconcile, which is that if you say a group of people should leave a place they want to stay in, you get accused of ethnic cleansing with a great deal of sense from many people. How the settlement of what happens in Gaza takes place still feels a very, very long way away from being settled by people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. Trump's comments last week saying that he and the U.S. would eventually take ownership, taking the land of Gaza. He also said not only Saudi Arabia could possibly take in Palestinians, but surrounding countries like Jordan and Egypt. It's important to note some people believe that Trump's comments are a little bit greater than what might the reality turn out to be, shooting for the stars and aiming and achieving somewhere a bit lower. And some people believe that that's a possibility. Of course, the number one thing that everyone here in Israel is focused on are getting these captives out of Hamas captivity. Just last night, while he was boarding a plane to the Super Bowl, Trump made comments saying that the time is going to run out. These hostages need to come out. They look like Holocaust survivors. He was also comparing it to that point. I think right now in the short term, they're trying to find a solution to get these hostages out while also planning the future, of course. But I think there is an immediate pressure as we're seeing these horrific conditions of these hostages.
And I think also the future feels a very long way away still, doesn't it, to many people. Shosh, good to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Shosh Bedrosian, their reporter in Tel Aviv. A couple of people responding to that. I just can't get a flavour of that. I very much sympathise with what she's saying, and I sympathise with all the hostages and the way they were treated. Nevertheless, your guest must remember that those 3 hostages are at least alive, while thousands and thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by the Israeli armed forces. Another fact to remember is that other hostages have been released, were treated well. These 3 may not have been treated well because of the problems going on in the Gaza Strip. This question of whether, when you see hostages looking so emaciated, does it harden the Israeli position towards the conflict? And this notion of, we still, Kate feels, but whatever Trump says, whatever Netanyahu says, there's no one has an idea of how this is going to end yet, it still feels like.
No, and I think that's one of the most pressing questions is what is the end game here and how does it work, and who can ensure, a bit like our conversation around Ukraine and Russia, who can ensure a lasting peace there? If you haven't seen the cartoon in today's Times, do have a look at that. It does reflect on this question about whether what we're seeing now is a repeat of what we saw in the Holocaust, and it's a really powerful cartoon if you haven't had a look at that this morning.
زهير وشام السماء. جبل